All right, so we have learned aggregate demand and aggregate supply separately, right? And particularly regarding to aggregate supply. So I emphasize the difference between short run and a long run, all right? And so we also have like a quick exercise to see what happens if we are not producing at our potential GDP, how the aggregate supply is going to respond, largely through labor market, right? Now we are ready to bring everything together, okay? So we are going to use this aggregate demand and aggregate supply model to understand what causes recession, how the economy is going to respond. From the response of the economy, we will understand the potential role of the government. And you should realize we are making a giant leap compared to the previous chapter. Because in the previous chapter, so yes, we also studied the determination of GDP in the short run in terms of fluctuation. But there, we only look at demand. We assume the supply is going to passively match with demand. And then there is a price is given. Now here we are going to see a big model that's going to determine not only the GDP, but also the price, right? So that's where we are going to achieve. So first of all, so like before, we are going to bring AD and SF, AS together. And usually, so they cross each other. So then so we are in equilibrium. Okay? And this is called short run macroeconomic equilibrium. Actually, so this level of GDP is what we can actually produce. Okay, so this is what we actually produce, right? And this price, this is the equilibrium price, right? So this short run equilibrium aggregate price, right? Okay. Okay. Now, just imagine for some reason, the economy is going to receive some shock. But now you may wonder, so what kind of shock we can potentially have? So we can list all of them, right? So we have demand side, we have supply side. But for each side, there are two possible shocks, right? So either it's a positive or negative, positive or negative. So that just means we have possibly 4 shocks, okay? And here, so I'm going to keep this table. Okay, and this table is going to tell you after each shock, how the price is going to change, how the GDP is going to change. So that's quite important. Okay, I'm going to keep this. But now let's go one by one. Okay, let's say, for example, if there's a negative demand shock. So what is considered as a negative demand shock? Example. 2020 in the spring. So everywhere we were hit by COVID-19. Okay, even without the government intervention, I would say most people will prefer to stay at home as possible as they can, right? So people are feared of get infected by these deadly virus. So they do not want to go to shopping mall, don't want to travel, don't want to dine out. So that is constitute a negative demand shock, right? Because you don't want to get caught by the virus. You don't want to go shopping outside. So then demand is going to decline. And then so in our framework, this just means the demand curve is going to shift to the left. Now let's see what happens to our economy. With this new aggregate demand curve, you're going to see a new equilibrium, right? So here we move from E1 to E2. Okay? And then so we compare E1 to E2, what do we see? So the GDP is going to decline. Price is going to decline as well, because there's no demand. So this is the first one. But opposite to that, we can see positive demand shock. But what is a positive demand shock? Okay. And then the reverse of the COVID-19. Now, so we have good vaccination. And I heard the news, Pfizer, they have a new treatment. So this treatment is so effective, they even stopped the trial earlier, right? And it is so effective. I heard from the news. So this new drug, so if you got, even you got COVID-19, so you take the drug, and 90% of people don't need to go to see the doctor. Or sorry, so I take it back. So yes, you need to get see the doctor to get the prescription, right? So, but you get this drug, so only 1%, less than 1% of people eventually end up with hospital. It's very effective, right? So if eventually this get approved by FDA, get approved by CDC, and is widely available, what does that mean? And we don't need to wear this face mask. We can go wherever you want. So that is going to a huge lift for aggregate demand. And we can potentially return to our normal, right? So then, so in our graph, they just says, okay, aggregate demand lift up. So now we are going to move from E1 to E2. This part. So this means if the positive demand shock, price will increase, correct? And output is going to increase, right? So now we go to other two possible shocks, okay? So this includes positive supply shock. But you may be wondering, what is a positive supply shock? So first of all, so this is work through supply. Secondly, this is positive. One way to think about is there is technological breakthrough. Say, for example, the metaverse, right? So this is something Facebook is trying to push into, right? So metaverse. Let me write that in case you haven't heard about that metaverse. And I heard news, Microsoft is also pushing this direction. But what's this technology? This technology is going to make remote collaboration more real, more immersed. All right? So that's going to boost our productivity if it is success, if it is work as it promised. So it's going to improve our productivity. So that's considered as a lift to aggregate supply, right? So and then, so aggregate supply curve is going to shift to the right. And similarly, we can compare, right? What are we going to see? We are going to see lower price and higher GDP. Then the last possible shock to the economy is the negative supply shock. Give you an example. Due to the COVID-19, there's a disruption in supply chain, okay? So if you are a gamer or if you have a friend who is like playing game, so you probably know it's very difficult to get a GPU. Not only gamer is scrambling to get a GPU, now the car makers, they cannot finish their car because of shortage of the chips, right? So, I mean, I heard of people, so it's hard, it's difficult to buy a car, even you have cash. And the other day I was reading news, this year, the average price of the car sale is more than 10% higher compared to last year, right? So that's considered a negative supply shock, okay? And then, so supply curve is going to shift to the left. Now what happens? So the price is going to rise, output is going to decline. This is kind of exactly what happens, right? So the GPUs becomes expensive, cars becomes expensive, but still you cannot get. Like personally, I was trying to get a desktop for myself because I do programming. I need a GPU inside. I'm not playing game, I just need a GPU to do some programming. I ordered my desktop a month ago, but so I keep receive emails says it's get delayed. We cannot deliver your computer. So that's an example of negative supply shock. Right? So now let's go back to here. So we have seen 4 possible shocks, right? So let's finish this part. If it is positive supply, price is going to decline, output is going to increase. If it's apologize, this should be negative, then the price is going to increase, supply is going to decrease. Why we need this table? So if you read this table carefully, so just sorry, let me just give you more space so you can see this table clear. So if we read this table carefully, we see some pattern. If we hit by a demand shock, whether it's a positive or negative, what we're going to see is both the price and output, they are going to move in the same direction. Right? So in the same direction, if it's a demand shock. But on the other hand, if it is a supply shock, so they are going to move in the opposite direction. But how we are going to use this observation? So this is going to help us to identify the culprit of economic problem, or help us to identify the cause of the economic fluctuation. So we can simply look at historical data, look at the fluctuation of price and the fluctuation of output. So this is what we can observe. Okay, remember in module 2, so we spent 1 chapter to explain how we measure in price level and how we measure in GDP. So we get those measures. And then so to see how they move over time. And interestingly, so look at US data. So we find out that most of the time, whenever they move or whenever they fluctuate, they move in the same direction. And then, so based on this table, it suggests, so most of our economic fluctuation was caused by demand shock, right? But this doesn't say supply shock will never present. As a matter of fact, currently we are experiencing both the demand shock and the supply shock. But just simply, so most of the time, the problem is caused by demand shock. But actually, when we have a supply shock, the things can be nasty, so as I'm going to show you later. But for now, make sure you understand so how each shock is going to affect our economy, and what's the patterns of the impact of those shocks. So that's what we need to know. Okay. Very good. So I said this promise, right? So the very bad shock is caused by a supply shock. All right, so if it's a negative supply shock, the good and the service hard to get. Like example I give to you, GPU is hard to get. And even worse, the price rise. Even though you want to pay for a higher price, you cannot get. Okay? So this is stagflation. Okay? Actually, stagflation is a combined word. It's coming from this part is inflation, price rise. STAG, stag, comes from stagnant, means we are not growing. Okay? Stagflation means we have double hit. Price is rising, it's going to eat away your purchasing power. At the same time, production is declining. So that just means your income is going to decline, right? So there's like a double hit. So this is caused by negative supply shock. This is very nasty, and we have very little to do. Toward the end of this chapter or this lecture, I'm going to show you, so if we are hit by a negative supply shock, if we are in this stagflation, so the central bank or the government is going to face a very challenging situation. is facing the dilemma. Okay, let's just bear with me for a second. Now let's see, right, so sorry, like here, right? So just summarize. Apology. Okay, yeah, so here, which type of recession is more common? So based on the table, and by looking at the data, and we find a demand shock are the usual culprit, meaning, so usually the fluctuation is caused by demand shock, right? Negative supply shock, they are rare, but once we get that point, they can be very nasty. 1970, because of the Iranian Revolution and because of Arabia-Israel war, there's a sharp decline in the supply of oil. But oil, at least at that point of time, was extremely important for manufacturing, for modern economy. So that was considered a big negative supply shock. Okay, and in the US, we also experiencing high inflation, right? So if you have, I guess your parents probably too young. So if you know someone who bought a house in 1980s, early 1980s, or who was working or looking for a job in 1980s, so you probably know, or you can ask your family members, whoever is in the prime age in 1980. At that point in time in the United States, the unemployment rate is very, very high. Many people lost their job. At the same time, the mortgage is very expensive. So the mortgage rate can easily go to 20%. Just imagine how expensive that can be. That just means you buy a house, you make a loan of 100K, so you need to pay 20K per year for the interest. That's a lot of money. All right. Okay. But for the rest of the class, I mean, for this lecture, so we will primarily focus on demand shock. Right? But again, that doesn't mean we can ignore supply shock. Okay, it doesn't mean supply shock is okay. So as a matter of fact, we cannot ignore it happened, and it will happen. And then once it happened, so it's very difficult to dealing with. Okay, right. To understand the cause of recession, okay, use this framework we just developed. So now I'm going to formally define this long-run macroeconomic equilibrium. The way we understand this long-run macroeconomic equilibrium, you may want to understand like this background picture. So you have equilibrium on top of another equilibrium. So first, we are in a short-run equilibrium. Okay, meaning the aggregate demand equal to short-run aggregate supply. So this is going to give you the price and the output. So this is number one. Now, when we are in the long-run macro equilibrium, we must have, let's call E, okay? So this E. We need this P, this YE, so long run. So this YE equal to YP. So in that sense, okay, so we are in the short-run equilibrium, but this short-run equilibrium must coincide with long-run aggregate supply. So in that sense, that's equilibrium on top of another equilibrium. Now use graph. Let me show you with graph. So you start with aggregate demand, short-run aggregate supply. You end up with short-run equilibrium, right? So here you presumably you have YE, right? Now we say we are in a long-run macro equilibrium. It's when YE, this is what you actually can produce in the short run, is exactly equal to what you can potentially produce, right? Or in other words, these three curves is going to cross at the same point. Okay, so it's very challenging, right? You can see. But I'm going to show you later, and through the discussion in the following slide, you can see somehow, so the economy is going to have a mechanism, always push us back to here, right? Okay, so this just tells you, right? So long run equilibrium, potential output, short run match with long run, okay? Okay, so now let's see what happens if we are hit by a shock. Well, again, so we are going to focus on demand shock. Okay, toward the end, so I'm going to talk about supply. Okay. So I'm going to show you once we hit by a demand shock, first, how the economy is going to respond. And then secondly, how the economy is going to adjust. Right? So the response happens more or less like in the short run, this adjustment happens in the long run. Okay, so there are two steps. Okay. Let's say we are initially at a long run equilibrium. Okay, so you just follow the definition we just had. Okay, that's where we are. Now, consider a negative demand shock. Again, what is a negative demand shock? COVID-19 hits, so you don't want to go out for shopping. Okay, and then the aggregate demand will decline, right? So now in the short run or immediately, what happens? We enter here, right? So that just means, so we are going to enter the recession, right? The actual GDP is going to be below potential GDP. So there's a recessionary gap. At the same time here, so you can see price is going to decline. So this is after a negative demand shock. All right. On the other hand, so if there is a positive demand shock, okay, like significant currently, so we have good news from Pfizer. Okay, and then so what happens is that demand is going to lift off, right? And then so you can see the output is going to exceed your potential. Furthermore, so you have a price gap. And so that's why we call this an inflationary gap. Usually this is called expansion. This after some recession, and then economy start to rebound. Right. So this is what happens in the short run, immediately after a shock hit our economy. Either it's a positive demand shock or negative demand shock. Okay, these two slides just tells you how in the short run, our economy is going to respond to two types of shock from the demand side, right? And to summarize, we have looked at recessionary gap, usually caused by a negative demand shock, and then the aggregate output is below potential. Okay, and we also could have an inflationary gap. So this is when aggregate output is exceeding the potential output. You produce more than you can potentially produce, right? So in either case, we can define an output gap as the percentage difference between your actual production and the potential output. Okay, so and so here, so this is a percentage change. Right, so this is output gap. So if it is a positive output gap, means we are in expansion. If it is negative, we are in a recession. Okay. Now we just studied what happens if we are hit by a shock. right? So next, the economy is going to respond, right? So this response is before government intervenes, or I would say probably it's in absence of government intervention. Or put another way, so for the moment, we ignore the government. Okay, we just see, so what happens? The economy is going to, sorry, what happens if the economy is hit by a shock? How the economy is going to adjust, right? So now let's see what happened. So from this graph, right now, so we are in the inflationary gap. So this is after a positive demand shock. Right, after positive demand shock, as we see from the previous slide, price is going to rise. Output is going to exceed potential. Right, so this is immediate after a positive shock. Now, if we give the economy some time, what is going to happen next? Or how the economy is going to respond? The answer to that question lies on what happened or the status of labor market. First, let's identify what happens in labor market. So at this level of output, this just means the labor market is very tight. Means, so we are hiring a lot. And furthermore, this means the unemployment rate is very low, right? Because we are producing beyond our potential, right? Like I said in the previous lecture, so this means usually we operate 5 days a week, 10 hours per day. Now we must operate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So that means we must hire a lot. That means the unemployment rate is low. If that's the case, what this means to wage? Wage must rise, correct? Because there's a shortage of labor. You must offer higher wage to attract potential worker, right? So now if wage increase, what does that means to short-run aggregate supply? So we talked about earlier, right? So if nominal wage increase, the profitability of the business is going to decline. Aggregate supply is going to decline. So hence, so the aggregate supply is going to decline as well. But in this graph, this means, so this curve is going to shift to the left-hand side. Now, you see, so we are going to move from E1 to E2, this after a positive demand shock. But then the labor market start to adjust. Because the unemployment rate is low, job are plentiful, wage increase, and then, so the supply is going to adjust. So now we are going to move from E1, E2, E3. And eventually we return to our potential GDP. And then we return to the long run equilibrium. Okay? So that's what happened if there's a positive demand shock. Right. So now we look at other side of the story. What happened if we receive a negative demand shock? Like what happened during early stage of COVID-19. Okay. And then so you can see, so we are going to move from E1 to E2, we enter the recession. Price decline. So again, how the economy is going to adjust over time? The answer lies into the labor market. Labor market. So in the labor market, so this unemployment implies, so this recession implies unemployment rate is elevated, right? And the wage must adjust. There are so many people don't have a job, and then they are willing to work for lower wage because that's better than nothing. Okay, so that means the wage will decline, right? So if wage decline, what does this mean to short run aggregate supply? Wage decline, cheaper to hire, more profitable for business. Aggregate supply is going to increase, right? So hence you can see the economy is going to respond by move from E1 to E2, and then E2 to E3. Again, so we eventually return to our potential GDP. Right? So this is after a negative demand shock. So from these two slides, you can see, so regardless is a positive demand shock or, positive demand shock or negative demand shock, regardless of what happened, over time, the economy is going to adjust. It's going to respond via adjusting in labor costs. And eventually we will return to our potential output. Right? So this is what happened. Now, so I want to give you 1 minute to answer the following questions. So essentially just without seeing the graph on the slides, just give you 1 minute to review what we discussed to make sure so you understand what happened, right? So you need to do the following, okay? Use the AD and AS model we just discussed. And then to see what a self-correcting mechanism means. That's essentially, so they're going to respond in the labor market, right? And then explain to yourself or to a partner what this means and how this self-correcting mechanism works, right? I give you 1 minute. All right, I guess that just leave for you to review, okay? So we can look at these practice questions in class. Let's suppose an economy is in short-run equilibrium. And in this short-run equilibrium, level or real GDP is less than potential. Now this question asks you which of the following statement is true. So again, as I just mentioned earlier, so usually we assume we hit by demand shock. This is number one. Now, the real GDP is below potential. So from the discussion we have earlier, so this is caused by a negative demand shock, right? Okay, with the negative demand shock, what's going to happen afterwards? So let's go one by one, okay? In the long run, nominal wage will fall and its short-run aggregate supply will shift left, restoring the economy to potential output. So after a negative demand shock, usually we enter a recession. So the recession is going to lead to high unemployment rate, and usually the wage will fall, right? And if the wage falls, eventually aggregate supply will increase. So it means aggregate supply will shift to the right. So and then so A, most part is correct, except here. Right? So actually B is correct. Nominal wage will fall. Why? After a negative demand shock, we are in a recession. This leads to unemployment rate is high. And then so eventually wage will go down. Wage go down, and then the short run aggregate supply will increase. Means move to the right. And eventually we are going to restore our long run macroeconomic equilibrium by producing at our potential level. Okay, so B is correct. Right. The other one. Now instead of less than, so now we are in the other situation, greater than potential output. Again, so here we focus on demand shock. So this means we have a positive demand shock. We are in an inflationary gap. Okay, with this positive demand shock, in the inflationary gap, essentially we are in the expansion. So now here, so unemployment rate. What happened to unemployment rate? The unemployment rate will be low, right? If unemployment rate is low, what happened to wage? The wage, no, unemployment rate is low, the wage eventually must rise because there's a shortage of labor. Right? Because everyone need a job, they have a job. And even worse, because unemployment rate is low, so the employer, they cannot find enough help. So they must raise the wage to attract good candidates. Right? But if wage increase, so that's going to lead to short run aggregate supply to decline. Right? So now let's go this one by one. A, nominal wage have to adjust upward. So this refers to this part, right? So this is correct. B, yes, unemployment rate is low, job are plentiful. Yes. D, to reach long run equilibrium, the short run aggregate supply will shift to left, meaning reduce. So this refers to this part, is correct. Hence, the answer is E. Okay, A, B, C, D, they are all correct. Right? And here, there's another practice, okay, this discussion. So instead of look at the short run, so this discussion or this practice asks you to look at or use the ADS model to illustrate long run economic growth. But the long run economic growth essentially just says long run aggregate supply, long run aggregate supply, shift to right hand side. Okay, and then so what caused this curve to shift? So remember we talked about human capital, physical capital, technology, labor supply. Okay, so those factors can cause these vertical line move to the right, or there's an increase in long run aggregate supply. Right, I'll leave that for you. Okay. All right, so to summarize what we learned. So we use this ADS model. We look at two possible shocks: negative demand, positive demand. All right. So in either case, the economy is going to adjust largely through labor market, through wage, that eventually is going to restore long run equilibrium, right? So this is what happened. Okay. And from this discussion, it is suggests the economy or our market economy has the ability to self-correcting its mistake or to self-heal its wound, right? Whether this is a positive shock or negative shock. But however, so this adjustment process, let's go back to previous line. So what I mean in adjustment, okay, use negative supply shock as an example. So by the way, so this process from E1 to E2 and E3. So this is self-correcting. All right. So this is called self-correction. So this suggests the economy has ability to self-heal its wound. But however, so this process can be costly, can be lengthy. It is costly in the sense, so we are experiencing potential output loss. We are going to experience unemployment rate, high unemployment rate, like in 1930, right? So the high unemployment rate was 25%. The GDP gap was 27%, right? So it's very costly. Not only it is costly, it can be very lengthy. So this adjustment process, this can last a few years or even a decade. Just imagine, so we lose a quarter of a job, we lose a quarter of our output for a decade. So that is extremely painful to the economy, right? Yes, the economy can self-restore, but this process can be too painful to bear. Okay? So that is to give us some justification for government intervention. But then, so how the government can help? Let's again use this as an example. Okay? So the market is going to move from here to here and to here, right? As I just mentioned, so this adjustment is very, very painful and it takes a while. Now just imagine if somehow the government can help by, say for example, because now you are seeing a decline in output, sorry, decline in demand. So what happens if the government can lift off aggregate demand, prevent the aggregate demand to fall, if that is possible? And then so we are going to avoid this adjustment. We will stay here, or we return to this point promptly, right? But then so you're wondering, okay, how the government can play that magic. The answer is simple. So the government can spend, or the government can give households some income, right? Two examples. Example number one, so after Great Depression, so the government has like new deals. So they start to massive amount of spending program, right? Like the US, so the national highway system, okay? Or like in Colorado, so this Hoover Dam, right? So this creates this demand. Other example, COVID-19. So 2020, so most of American family received a check from the government. I'm not sure have you received a check or not. Okay, so our households receive a couple of checks several times. So that is going to help us to spend, leave up the spending, right? So that's going to prevent this aggregate demand to fall, or just help this to move back. So we are going to return this point as quick as possible. right? So by the way, so regarding to the government's role, we are going to have a more detailed discussion in the next chapter. But for now, just give you a flavor. Okay. So yes, the economy can self-correct, but so there's plenty of room for government to step in. Right? So this is what happened. Okay, instead of go to this route. Okay, just follow my, let me just erase everything. Instead of we go to this route, and maybe we can, okay, so we fall, and then the government is going to help lift up, and then we return, bounce back. That's the difference. Okay, so you just fall a little bit, and then so you bounce back very quickly. So that's literally what happened in 2020. But in 1930, so we don't have this diagram. We haven't discovered this diagram yet. So that's why we took a long recovery. But in 2020, in 2008 financial crisis, so with the help of this diagram, so we fall, and but then so we quickly bounce back. All right. So let's go to these slides. Right. First, the economy is able to self-correct. But this self-correct is going to take a while. It can take a decade or even longer, like what happened in 1930. Right? And then furthermore, so this is going to show us the potential role the central government can play. And we call this stabilization policy. So this is use government policy to reduce the severity of the recession. Right? Like in the previous slide shows, instead of go to a long route, we just decline and bounce back quickly. This not only works for a recession, it also works during expansion. And some students may be wondering, okay, why we care about expansion? Isn't that good? Remember, expansion also brings some costs because everything comes with cost. Nothing is free. You have expansion, you have overheat, you have inflation. If the inflation is too high, so we are in another dangerous territory. Okay, so we already have a flavor what the cost of inflation can bring us. Right, so we'll go that in details after this chapter. But here the main message is, so the government can play a major role in stabilize the aftermath of a demand shock, whether it's a positive demand shock or negative demand shock. For the positive demand shock, the government can stabilize the inflation. If it is a negative demand shock, the government can stabilize the prolonged period of unemployment. Okay, so all of this was first discovered by John Maynard Keynes. He was considered as the father of modern macroeconomics. Right? And he has a famous saying. So we have seen this quote before. This long run is a misleading guide. So here, this long run just refers to this adjustment. Right? So the economies can adjust and can restore to its long run potential over time. But he believed this long run is misleading. Long run is misleading in the sense, in the long run, we all dead. It just means, okay, so this adjustment can be very painful, very lengthy. It's very costly. So we can do something to reduce the pain, to limit the damage, to help us to bounce back. So that is his philosophy. And actually, everything we discuss, we usually call this Keynesian macroeconomics. So this has been widely used by most modern government, right? Here, this is historic evidence. Great Depression. Unemployment rate stood at 25% for prolonged period, right? So this is a decade. Okay. Yes, eventually went down because of the self-correction, right? Unemployment is so high, and the wage was fall. Wage fall, and then eventually the short-run aggregate supply will shift up. So that's literally what happens. That's literally what we mean long run. It's too painful. And then since then, so we discover modern macroeconomics. And then so start from here, so economists start to use the tools we discussed. Right? For certainty, okay, what do we expect today? It's more than what we know in 1950. Otherwise, there's no point, right? So we are learning something like we know in 1950. So we add above or add many things. But those things were first discovered around that time. But you can see, so since then, so the recession relatively mild in the sense the damage is smaller and relatively shorter, because usually, yes, you have high unemployment, but it's lasts for a few weeks or a few months, right? So like 2020, yes, you have suddenly spike in unemployment rate, but this unemployment rate declined very sharply, right? So largely because of the government steps in, largely because of the stabilization policy. But all in all, we must thank John Maynard Keynes for he first discovered the secret of macroeconomy, right? Now, as I just mentioned earlier, supply shock exists. And the supply shock can be nasty. And furthermore, when we hit by a negative supply shock, not only it is nasty, it is also very difficult to cure. In a sense, we are facing a very challenging dilemma. Okay, now let me use a graph to explain to you what happens after a negative supply shock. What is the dilemma the central bank or the government must face? By the way, so in this background, so this is a chairman, he was a chairman during the time of financial crisis. Okay, he was facing that dilemma. Okay, now let me use a diagram. But this is the same diagram we just see before. Initially, we are in this long run equilibrium. If there's a negative supply shock, we will move to here. Okay, we will move to here. Let's label them. Let's call it E2. We start with E1. All right. So now compare E1 to E2. We are in a stagnation. Stagnation. So this just means we have a stagnant in our economy. So this means your Y is less than your YP. So this further means unemployment rate is high. Now, stagnation, this stagnation means inflation, means price is very high. Okay, you have inflation. Right? Like earlier we talked about, so the inflation is going to bring on some costs. The unemployment is also painful because people lose their job, right? You cannot get paycheck to pay your bill to support your family. And then the government, the central bank, trying to dealing with these two problems. But unfortunately here, so our option is very limited. And we even face a dilemma. Now let's see what happens. So if you want to reduce unemployment, what you can do? Like I just discussed, So you can so this, let's label this aggregate demand, short run aggregate supply, short run aggregate supply. Let's go 2, 1. What you can do? You can leave off aggregate demand, right? So say you go here, and then so you move from E2 to this part, and then you get rid of unemployment, right? But what happened next? What happened in terms of inflation? So you are going to make the inflation problem even worse, correct? Because the price is going to shoot up even higher. So this means if you dealing with this problem, you are going to lead to even higher price. Now, if you care more about inflation, and then what you can do? You must, the only option you have is you reduce aggregate demand, right? I mean, in terms of tool you have, so you reduce aggregate demand. Now, if you reduce aggregate demand, so you're going to move from this point to here. Let's call this E3, this E4. So if you move from E2 to E4, yes, price decline. You're dealing with inflation. But now, so you're going to enter the deeper recession. So this is going to increase, right? To summarize, we hit by a negative supply shock. We have double hit. We have recession. We have inflation. For policymaker, so they face a dilemma. If you want to deal with unemployment, you make inflation worse. If you want to kill inflation, you make recession deeper, right? So that's a dilemma. So that's make lots of trouble, okay? So this slide is summary, right? The stabilized aggregate output requires increased aggregate demand. This leads to unemployment, right? So you reduce unemployment at a cost of higher inflation. On the other hand, if you want to reduce inflation, this is going to cost at a higher unemployment. So that's a dilemma. That's a nasty aspect of a negative supply shock. Okay. All right. So up to now, so we have finished the discussion of aggregate demand versus aggregate supply, right? And we also use this aggregate demand, aggregate supply to understand the cause of recession, right? And further, so we use this aggregate demand and aggregate supply to understand how the economy is going to adjust. So this adjustment is without the government intervention. But from this adjustment process, we see the role of government, right? So it seems like the government can play a role by reduce the damage, right? By restoring the economy so that we can limit the damage. We can help our economy to bounce back quicker, stronger, more resilient. So all of this discussion leads to the role of government. And then so after this lecture, we are going to move to the final module of this class. So in there, we are going to look at government policy. This includes physical and a monetary policy. But certainly this physical and monetary policy was designed to help stabilize the fluctuation, to reduce the pain, right? But also, so this policy will help to promote long-run economic growth. So remember, so macroeconomics is about long-run economic growth and a short-run fluctuation, right? So the government policy is designed to stabilize the fluctuation in the short run, and promote the growth in the long run. Right? So for the moment, so we have to understand the theory behind the long run economic growth. So that's essentially coming from technology, human capital, physical capital, right? And also we learn the fluctuation in the short run, essentially caused by the demand, right? That's going to prepare us for the discussion in the final module, right? Let's stop here for today.